Alright, so here we are in Visual Studio. I've already set up a CRM Developer Toolkit project, and I have a very simple JavaScript test. Now, the first walkthrough is going to be very hello world. I'm just going to show you how to use jastest.net to test JavaScript. Now, I'm doing it in the context of a CRM package, but frankly, there's nothing going to be CRM specific about what I'll show you first. So we'll come in here, I will add a new project, and under test, I'll just select a test project. And we'll call this JavaScript Unit Tests. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is go get jastest.net. This is a testing framework that you can learn a little bit more about through the link in my blog post, but it's the testing framework that I landed on because it enables you to call JavaScript code from C# unit tests, therefore integrating with, frankly, any unit testing framework that's C# based that you'd like to use. So I'm going to manage NuGet packages here. We're going to search online for JS test. Alright, so there's jastest.net. So I'll go ahead and install that. Close this. It'll come into my unit test and we'll just leave the standard stuff here. It'll clean this up. So the core class that enables all this in the jastest.net package is called TestScript. So we'll new up a test script. And notice that I'm using ReSharper, so if you don't have ReSharper, you're going to have to do some of this manually, but notice that TestScript comes from this JS test namespace. So what we want to do is we want to use this TestScript class to wire up testing this JavaScript file right here. So to do that, we're going to want to start by calling TestScript.append block, and then jastest.net actually comes with some libraries. And the first one we want to use here is called Jas Assert Library. And what this basically is going to do is going to make a JavaScript library for testing assertions available to us inside of the JavaScript. Alright, so the next thing that we want to do is we actually want to load up this file. To do that, we just call testscript.append file, and then we have to point to that file. So I know where that file is. It is, and let's make some room here. It is up 3 in the JavaScript unit testing package project under the web resources directory under script/jscript. How did I figure that out? Well, I just came in here and I said open containing folder, and then I navigated up. Right, and then I figured out that location for the file. And then the name of the file here is hello unittesting.js. Alright, so let's just go ahead and do this, make it easier to read. Okay, so now we've loaded up our assertion library, we've loaded up the JavaScript file we want to test, and then we just call testscript.runtest. And the first way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to inline some JavaScript in a string. I'll show you in the future how I move all this to a file because I think it's a cleaner approach. But for now, I'm simply going to make a call to that function that we want to test. And that function's called DKD form load. So let's call that. And then let's just go ahead and assert.equal. So this is part of this Jas Assert library that comes with jastest.net. And we want the we just want to do something very simple. We want to test that the value is 100. Right? We're just testing our initialization. So we're going to say 100, and we're going to use that variable because it's loaded now by the test script class. And that's really it. So if I come in here now and I refresh my test view, I've got a test method and I can say run. And my test passed. So how do I test if my test failed? So let's put an incorrect value. Let's say 10. And we can run. And in this case, my test failed, right? Because that assertion failed. So the first step here is that we see that we're getting integration with MS Test, the test results windows, etc. This will make more sense as we build on these simple examples. And what's nice about JSTest.net is that if you come in and debug your selection, it'll actually insert a debugger statement and cause the Windows script debugger to kick off. So we'll open this up in a new instance. And so from C#, I'm going to be able to debug right into my JavaScript. So notice, here's the code for my test. So what I can start doing here is just use standard JavaScript debugging keys. So I'm going to hit F10 to step over the debugger statement. If I hit F11, we're actually going to step right into the test that's targeting CRM. And obviously in this case, it's not targeting CRM yet, but you kind of get the idea. This is just a standard JavaScript file. I'm able to step through that code and then step through my assertion. So that's the basic fundamentals of using JSTest.net to set up a C# unit test, which will then load up this assertion library, load up the JavaScript file we want to test, and then allow me to execute a JavaScript unit test. So assertion library through append block, append file, run test. And that's the same pattern you're going to see over and over again. You're going to new up test script, you're going to append blocks or files, and then you're going to run the test. And so one of the things that hopefully you've recognized in this is that we never launched a browser, we never deployed to the CRM server, and what JSTest.net does is it basically uses the Windows scripting host to execute this JavaScript. So what we want to do next is build on this core concepts of using JSTest.net and sprinkle in some additional CRM context. So I'm going to switch over here to a finished project that I have. Similarly, I've done the same thing with a more involved CRM test. Now notice what's going on here. Loading up the assertion library. I'm loading up a JavaScript file called lead form data. Then I'm loading up a JavaScript file called XRM page template. This is how we're going to mock the XRM page API. Then I'm loading up the actual file that gets deployed to CRM. That's this file right here. The leadform.js file. And then I'm loading up my JavaScript test file. So if I look over back over here and I go to lead tests, I have a function called test on save that sits in here. And so I load the file and then I call the function. So that's that added change that I created so that I'm not inlining my JavaScript. I'm just making a simple call to the actual JavaScript unit test, and I keep all that stuff, I keep all that stuff in a separate file. So again, we have C# test, which wraps my JavaScript unit test, which calls into my JavaScript file that will be deployed to Dynamic CRM. And then I'm just loading up the relevant files in order to run these tests. So back to lead form data and XRM page template. Where do those come from and how they allow us to mock XRM page? That's the question you should be asking yourself right now. But before we do that, let's actually go into the actual CRM code. So what happens on save? I think that's what the first test is. Yep, test on save. What happens on save? Well, we get the value of the company, we get the value of the last name, and then I just do some basic XRM page interaction where I set the value of description to the previous two values concatenated. Right? Well, if I'm going to run this in a unit test, I need to be able to mock XRM page so that it'll return values for me in my unit test. And how do I do that? Well, I'm going to use a utility that comes with the CRM 2011 SDK called the Page Script Project Template. To find that, you just go into your SDK download in the templates directory, in the xrm.pagescript project template directory. You'll find a README, you'll find a CRM managed solution, and you'll find a Visual Studio add-in. And if you read through the documentation here, basically what it tells you to do is install the Visual Studio add-in, import the managed solution, and then it walks you through how to use this template. So let's jump out real quick. I'm just in an empty project here. Create a new project, and this is just to get you to understand what this template does. So we'll search for XRM, and we'll create a new project off of this template. And what you'll see here is that you get an HTML page that then references two files, page data, XRM, three files, page data, XRM page template, and my library. So if you then open up this scripts folder, here's what page data looks like. It's basically a bunch of JSON that is used by this XRM page template JavaScript file to essentially mock the XRM page API. And then my library just uses the XRM page API. So what I've done is I've taken what's already in the SDK that's given to you to test sort of in isolation outside of CRM via an HTML page, and I'm applying it to unit testing. So what I did is I grabbed the page data and the XRM page template JS files, and I brought them into my project. So if I come over here, you'll see that in the reference scripts, I have the XRM page template, and in the form data folder, I have the lead form data.js. Okay, great. But what if you need to get data from some other place? Well, the way this works is once you've installed that managed solution into your CRM organization, you get this button on the Customize tab that gives you the XRM page snapshot, and it'll give you the state of the form, whatever it's in at the current time. And there's also some events that you can choose from, etc. And so if I click Get Data here, notice that I could just copy all this, come into this file, and paste it, and I've got, oops, let's do that again. Notice that I've got JavaScript object notation that represents this state, right? I'll just undo that just so we can go back to my existing tests. And so the point is that we're going to load up this file, XRM page template, and the data that will live behind XRM page template. And so for every test that you have, you'll have a different form data.js file representing that state. And so this becomes your mock with the state behind it. All right, so back to lead tests. So in summary, we've loaded up the test script class, or we've newed up the test script class. We've appended the Jas Assert Library. We're loading our form data. We're loading the XRM page template, which gives us that mock over the form data. We're loading the form file that gets deployed to CRM. And we're loading our tests JavaScript file, which actually executes the unit test, which is right here. So test on save basically calls lead on save, does an assertion, then uses XRM page in my unit test to check the value of assertion, We expect it to be this. And so we'd call an assert.equals. So let's just go ahead and walk through this. So I'll close that. Go to my test view here. Going to debug, test on save. So you notice that I had to launch a new instance of Visual Studio for script debugging. From here on out, you'll just leave this instance open, and it's much faster. All right, so I'll go ahead and step through my test. I'll go into step into it. Now we're in my JavaScript unit test. I can step into lead on save. Now we're in my actual CRM form code. Notice that when I F10, I'm debugging. I'm actually getting values. Boom. Now I'm outside of the call to my function. I'm setting up my expected value. I'm getting the value out of XRM page. There it is. We assert that they're equal. Boom, the test succeeded. Now if I come back to Visual Studio, there are my test results. It succeeded. So that's a very simple, how do we mock XRM page? And again, just for repetition, we essentially mocked XRM page by using the XRM page script template from the SDK plus a snapshot of the form data. We load all that stuff up. We load the actual form script that gets deployed to CRM. We load up our test file. We call our test. And it's all integrated into Visual Studio's test results. So here's an example. Let's just jump forward a little bit where this starts to become more valuable. When I run all tests in the solution, notice that I've got, let me sort these by project. Notice that I've got plugin unit tests and JavaScript unit tests running in the same Visual Studio solution, and they've all passed, right? And this is where unit testing really starts to pay off as you amass this series of tests, and you then go to make changes. You recognize quickly those changes break your tests, that you've got bugs and all sorts of good stuff, right? That's one of the big benefits of unit testing is the ability to have this ability to do regression testing off of your unit tests. All right, so that was a simple example of a function, lead on save, that interacts with the XRM page API and how to mock that. So the next thing we'll look at is, what about JavaScript code that's going to make web service calls? Maybe you're going to make a call back to the OData service. All right, so let's go take a look at test on load. So what does test on load do? So again, this is the actual JavaScript file that gets deployed to CRM. All right, so it interacts with XRM page, so we're obviously going to have to mock that. It builds out an OData query. Then it uses jQuery to make a call, get data back, and then extract that data and populate it in the form. But the key point here is that we're making a getJSON call using jQuery, and so we don't actually want to call jQuery, nor do we actually want to execute an AJAX call. What we want is to fake the test into this code into believing that it got values back through our unit test. Right? Unit testing is all about testing in isolation. We don't want to constantly call this web service in our unit tests. So let's go back to our C# test. Remember that the C# test is following the same basic pattern. It's loading the form data, the page template, and the form. In this case, we're loading up another library called Recorder Mock. I have a link to a blog post that talks about how to mock jQuery, and Recorder Mock was my preferred approach when I compared some of the different approaches that I looked at. And so if we look in my reference scripts directory in my actual unit test project, I've got the recordermock.js file. And of course, we're loading up our actual JavaScript unit test, and then we're calling test on load. So let's go to our JavaScript unit test. So what Recorder Mock allows you to do is say, hey, instead of calling jQuery, make calls to jQuery, do whatever I say they're going to do. Right? In this case, when we're going to mock getJSON, and when getJSON is called, if the query is this URL right here, then we're going to call this function getFakeData. And if you look at getFakeData, it returns what the OData service would have returned in JavaScript object notation format. So how did I get this? Well, I used the handy, if you're not familiar with it, it's available on CodePlex. The handy OData query designer. I came in here, I created whatever the query was. In my case, it was this entity, right? And what I wanted to do is for name equals default title, and execute that. And you see your JSON results. Now, obviously, I don't want all those JSON results, so I came over here and I said, you know what? What I really care about is getting the value back. So we'll go back up, we'll generate that again, execute, and boom, that's the web service response. So I just came in here and in my call to getFakeData, I return those values right there. And if you notice, if I paste this in, it's the exact same form. I'll just undo that to format it, but it's the exact same response. So basically what I'm saying here is when the actual code calls getJSON and the OData query URL matches, call my getFakeData function, and then since what happens inside of a getJSON call is a callback, we're basically executing that callback right here, right? The first argument or the second argument of the call to getJSON. So let's look at that real quick. The second argument of the call to getJSON is a callback. And so what we're saying here is call that callback because it's the second argument. I'm calling it and I'm passing the data back. So then whatever is in my test code will be passed here. If it's some other URL, we get some other fake data, right? So this is sort of the example of how you use recorder mock to make my calls to getJSON return values so my unit test executes, even though I'm never actually calling a web service, right? Again, this is what unit testing is all about, testing in isolation. So we set this all up, then we actually call form load. Let's go back there. Form load goes through, it executes. This is going to work. We'll debug through this in just a second. And then at the end, we expect the top job title to be CEO because that's the value that is in my setting. That's the value that gets returned from the web service. Again, we're never actually calling the web service. All right, so let's go ahead and debug this. Notice this time around it says, what do you want to use? And I'm just going to say use an existing C script window. So quickly we jump right in. We're in our debugger. This is my call to my JavaScript unit test. We're actually in the JavaScript unit test right now. We're setting up the getJSON call. Now we can actually call the form load function. So we'll step into that. This just works because we've already mocked XRM page as we've seen in the previous example. We're building up our OData query. Boom. So I'm going to hit a breakpoint there. I'm going to come back here. I'm going to hit a breakpoint right there. Okay, so what's going to happen here is we're going to call getJSON. Notice we never loaded up jQuery. We never even referenced the jQuery library. We're just faking our code into believing that jQuery gets called. So I hit F5 here. We're back in my unit test code that said, hey, when jQuery getJSON gets called, go ahead and execute this code instead. The URL matches this query, so we're going to go ahead and build out that fake data. Then, if you did that I did that too fast, right? We're calling the callback because the callback is the second argument that was passed in, it in fact has the title CEO, and we're setting the value of job title. And then now we're back in our test. Now form load is completed. Now we're asserting the value that we got back. So we're basically, my code called the web service, or called the fake web service in this case. And then we're proving that the value we expect is got back through making a call back into XRM page. And then finally, we're just asserting that. Our test passed. Okay. So far we've seen two very basic hello examples to show how all this works, the plumbing. Then we showed an example that not only interacted with XRM page, but mocked, using recorder mocked jQuery's getJSON method so that we could execute a test on this code right here. So not only did we mock XRM page, but we mocked jQuery. And then the final example, let's say you want to test some HTML plus JavaScript web resource code. So let's actually look at an example. So here I have an HTML web resource called simple.htm. And then I have a web resource called simple.htm.js. And all this really does is it does a window.parent into the form that will contain this web resource. There's a common programming practice in CRM programming is to do a window.parent and get at the XRM API. We want to get the entity name. It's a very trivial example. And then we actually want to manipulate the HTML of this web resource. So in this case, we're using jQuery again, but we're manipulating the HTML of our web resource. So it's a little bit of a different scenario. So come back over to our tests. Same pattern, right? New test script, append Jas Assert Library, load up the lead form because we're still in this case, we're actually in the context of a form, but from a web resource. Load up our page template. We're going to be using recorder mock again. I've got this file called fakeglobals.js. And if we actually look at fakeglobals.js, basically, since my JavaScript code that we want to test, let's go back to that. It actually has code that interacts with the global document, right? You know, those are available to you in JavaScript when you're running in the browser. So what we need to do is fake those out. So I've just said document's a new object, I said window's a new object, and I've set window.parent is a new object, just so my test code will run. And then finally, I've used recorder mock to basically say when the ready function is called, take ownership, right? And if I wanted to, I could actually say do something when ready is called, but in this case, I don't really need to, because if you look at my code, basically all ready is doing is calling page on load, and so I'm going to test page on load explicitly. All right, so I've fake globals basically mocks document and window so that this code and this code will execute successfully in my test. Let's go back to the test. So I've loaded up fake globals. I've loaded up the actual JavaScript file. Notice I don't ever load up the HTML file because I don't need to. We're not executing this test within the context of the browser. And then I load up my test file. And then I call test simple web resource on load. And so if I go back to our actual JavaScript unit tests, what does this do? Well, first thing it does is we're going to set window.parent.xrm equal to xrm. What does that do? Well, XRM page template is loaded already. So when my code, the actual JavaScript that we want to test, does window.parent.xrm, we're setting it up such that window.parent.xrm points to the XRM page template. Then we're telling recorder mock when the HTML function is called, allow us to basically redirect. And so if you're familiar with moles, which is what I showed for unit testing of plugins, So it's very similar concept to what moles allows you to do. Basically says, when this thing's called, run my code instead. And so what we're saying here is that when the HTML method is called, execute my code. So we're getting the arguments that are passed in out. And if the actual text of the selector is main text, then we're going to go through here. Otherwise, say that this selector wasn't mocked yet. Right? So let's look back at that. So in my code, I'm saying $hash main text.html, and I'm basically loading some text plus the entity name. I get the entity name out of XRM page. I manipulate the HTML. Again, a very simple example to show you how to get going. But basically, my JavaScript code interacts with jQuery. We're faking out through recorder mock that call to jQuery for this main text selector. And so notice that when you call HTML with an argument, I'm saying, okay, if the first argument is not null, then we're just setting this local variable to whatever was passed in. Otherwise, we're just going to return this. So what is that? Well, notice that down here, we'll actually get the value out via the .html call. Right? So that just returns that value there. So we're arranging things. We're getting window.parent.xrm set up. We're using recorder mock to set up the call to HTML. We're calling page onload, which is in our actual function inside of the JavaScript file that gets deployed to CRM. And then finally, we're setting up what we expect to get back. We're getting that value out. Now, in this case, I could have actually just used the value out of main text HTML, but I wanted to show you how to use recorder mock to actually call .html with one with arguments, one without, and then return what you want, right? So this is with arguments, this is without. And again, this is very similar to conceptually how moles works in terms of using delegates. And then finally, right, once we've got our expected and our actuals, we're just going to do an assertion. And so again, just to kind of bring it all home, we're going to run or debug our simple web resource test. We'll use our existing C script window, and then we'll just start debugging our code. So XRM page, it's got a value, setting up recorder mock, boom, boom, let's set some breakpoints there. I'll hit F5, I'll step in by hitting F11, boom. Now we're in our actual CRM JavaScript code. We got a value for XRM, we're getting the entity name out, we're setting the value using jQuery of the HTML. Then of course it hits my code, it's going to fake it out. So we're getting the value this time, right? So now we've got the expected, we're doing our assertion, boom, and of course our test succeeded. So you kind of get the point. We went from simple hello world, something that mocks XRM page, something that mocks XRM page and interacts with a web service using jQuery, and then something that not only mocks XRM page, but then interacts with jQuery for HTML DOM manipulation. And again, if I run all of these tests, they all execute without ever having to deploy this JavaScript to the server. I'm running both my JavaScript unit tests and my plugin unit tests, all using the controls that I'm familiar with in Visual Studio. And then when I'm ready and I want to do some integration testing, right, I can just right-click this. I can say deploy. All right, so my deploy succeeded. Now if I go over here, remember I mentioned in the beginning that I did this all with the lead entity. And I create a new lead. So boom, this is all that code in action now. I remember the onload wired up, made a call to the web service, and in this case it made a real call to the web service, got that default value. My web resource load, it reached back into the XRM page API to get the entity name. And then in this case, when I fill some stuff out, we'll say test name company and click save. Remember, I had some additional JavaScript that executed on save, and boom, there it is. There's that concatenation. So I was able to write this code and test it all without having to deploy it to the CRM server. I was able to run my unit tests, and then finally, once I got all that stuff working, I can right-click deploy and make sure it's all running within the context of the actual CRM server. And then again, I've got the beauty of having all of this run. So as you build these series of tests over time and your code base gets more complicated, etc., you have an extreme level of confidence that before you ever push this stuff to your CRM server for integration testing, that you've written more solid code than you probably would have if you weren't doing unit testing.